The numbers on Alan Blackwell's laptop screen blurred as exhaustion crept into her vision. 11:47 p.m., and she was still analyzing investment portfolios in the penthouse she shared with her husband Henry Romano. The irony wasn't lost on her that while Henry thought she was a struggling freelance consultant barely making ends meet, she was actually managing a trust fund worth $3.7 billion. Have you ever kept a secret so big it felt like it might consume you from the inside? That was Alan's reality every single day. She'd been the Blackwell heiress since her 21st birthday, inheriting the investment empire her grandfather built from nothing. But when she met Henry Romano 3 years ago at a charity gala, something about his intensity and mysterious business dealings made her decide to hide her true identity. She'd learned early that wealth attracted the wrong kind of attention, and Henry's world seemed complicated enough without adding billionaire wife to the equation. Alan closed her laptop and stretched, her neck aching from hunching over financial reports all evening. Henry's construction company had been expanding rapidly, taking on bigger contracts throughout Manhattan, and she'd been secretly proud of his success. Their marriage might not have been perfect, but she respected his ambition and drive. The way he commanded rooms, spoke with authority, handled problems that would crush other men. He was everything she'd never expected to fall for. The penthouse felt too quiet tonight. Henry had texted earlier saying he'd be working late, handling some crisis with a new project in Brooklyn. She glanced at her phone, considering calling him, but decided against it. He'd been stressed lately, dealing with what he described as difficult investors and complex negotiations. The last thing he needed was his wife checking up on him like some clingy housewife. Instead, she decided to surprise him. Henry's office was only 20 minutes away, and she could stop by that little Italian place he loved and bring him dinner. Maybe they could eat together in his office, steal a few quiet moments away from their separate worlds that seemed to be pulling them in different directions lately. Alan changed from her comfortable yoga pants into dark jeans and a cashmere sweater, grabbed her purse and car keys. The drive through Manhattan's late-night traffic gave her time to think about how much her life had changed since meeting Henry. Before him, she'd been isolated by her wealth, surrounded by people who wanted something from her money rather than knowing her as a person. Henry was different. He was powerful in his own right, confident and successful, never asking her for anything beyond her company. If only he knew that company came with enough money to buy half of Manhattan. The security guard at Henry's building recognized her immediately. "Mrs. Romano, good evening," he said with a smile, waving her toward the elevators. Mr. Romano's still upstairs working hard as always. Alan thanked him and rode the elevator to the 32nd floor, takeout bags from Benedetto's filling the small space with aromas of garlic and fresh basil. Henry's company occupied the entire floor, a maze of cubicles and conference rooms surrounding his corner office with its spectacular view of the city. The main lights were dimmed, but she could see the glow from his office spilling into the hallway. She walked quietly through the empty workspace, heels clicking softly against polished marble floors. Henry's door was partially open, and she could hear voices inside. He wasn't alone, which explained why he'd been working so late. Probably dealing with those difficult investors he'd mentioned, trying to close some complicated deal that required evening meetings. Alan paused just outside his office, not wanting to interrupt an important business conversation. She'd wait until his meeting finished, then surprise him with dinner and maybe convince him to come home early for once. Through the gap in the door, she could see Henry's broad shoulders silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling windows, his dark hair perfectly styled even after a long day. But something was wrong with the scene unfolding before her eyes. Henry wasn't sitting across from investors around his conference table. He was standing near his desk, arms wrapped around a woman with long black hair and a figure that could stop traffic. Victoria Chun, his executive assistant. The same Victoria who'd been working for Henry's company for the past 8 months, who always answered his phone with professional efficiency, who'd sent Alan birthday flowers from Henry when he forgot. They weren't discussing business contracts or investor meetings. Henry's hands were tangled in Victoria's hair as he kissed her with desperate hunger, the kind of passion Alan hadn't seen from her husband in months. Victoria's fingers clutched at his shirt, pulling him closer as she pressed against his desk. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a single mistake. The way they moved together, the familiarity of their embrace, the comfortable intimacy of Victoria's hands on his face. This was a relationship with history. Alan's breath caught in her throat as the takeout bags slipped from numb fingers, hitting the marble floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo through her entire world. Neither Henry nor Victoria noticed the sound. They were too lost in each other, too focused on their own private universe that had nothing to do with the woman standing frozen in the doorway. She should have moved, should have confronted them, should have demanded an explanation. Instead, Alan found herself rooted in place, watching her marriage disintegrate in real time. Every kiss, every tender touch between them was a dagger through her chest, confirmation of suspicions she'd been trying to ignore for weeks. The late nights, the distracted conversations, the way Henry seemed to be living in a different world lately, one that apparently included Victoria Chun. How long? The question hammered through Alan's mind as she witnessed Henry caress Victoria's cheek with the same gentle touch he'd once reserved for his wife. How long had they been together? How long had her marriage been a lie? Victoria pulled back from Henry's embrace, her lips curved in a satisfied smile that made Alan's stomach twist with nausea. "Henry," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough for Alan to hear. "We need to be careful. Alan's been asking questions about your schedule lately. She's getting suspicious." Henry's response shattered what remained of Alan's world into pieces too small to repair. "She'll never figure it out," he said, stroking Victoria's hair with casual possessiveness. "Alan's too naive, too trusting. She thinks I'm just a successful construction contractor with normal business problems. She has no idea what I really do, who I really work for, or how dangerous my world actually is. And she definitely doesn't know that I've been planning to leave her for months." Victoria laughed, a sound like breaking glass in Alan's ears. Poor little Alan with her freelance consulting business, barely scraping by while married to one of the most powerful men in the Italian crime family structure. "She really doesn't know anything, does she?" "Nothing," Henry confirmed, his hands trailing down Victoria's sides with practiced familiarity. "She's completely clueless about everything. My business connections, my real income sources, my plans for our future. Alan lives in this bubble where she thinks we're just a normal married couple with normal problems. She has no idea that getting rid of her is just another business transaction I need to handle properly. Getting rid of her." The words hit Alan like physical blows, each syllable confirming her worst fears while revealing depths of betrayal she'd never imagined possible. Her husband wasn't just having an affair. He was planning to eliminate her from his life like an inconvenient business problem. Alan backed away from the office door on unsteady legs, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain Henry and Victoria would hear it echoing through the empty workspace. She had to get out of there before they discovered her eavesdropping on their intimate confession. Her mind raced with implications, with realizations that changed everything she thought she knew about her life. Henry Romano wasn't just a successful contractor. He was connected to organized crime, operating in a world of violence and calculation that she'd never suspected. And Victoria Chin wasn't just his assistant. She was his partner in business and apparently in planning Alan's permanent removal from their lives. The elevator doors closed behind Alan as she escaped Henry's building, her reflection in the polished steel showing a woman whose entire existence had just imploded. She looked the same on the outside, but inside, everything had changed. The naive, trusting wife who'd walked into that building no longer existed. As Alan drove home through empty Manhattan streets, her mind began working with crystalline clarity for the first time in months. Henry thought she was powerless, clueless, and helpless. He believed his wife was nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle between him and his future with Victoria. He assumed Alan had no resources, no connections, no ability to fight back against whatever plans he was making. Henry Romano was about to discover exactly how wrong he could be about someone he thought he knew completely. Because Alan Blackwell hadn't survived in the investment world by being naive or helpless. She'd built and protected a fortune by being smarter, more ruthless, and infinitely more dangerous than anyone expected from someone who looked like Manhattan's perfect wife. And now she had a very specific target for all that carefully hidden power. Alan spent the sleepless night in her home office, surrounded by financial documents that would have made Henry's head spin if he'd ever bothered to look closely at what his wife actually did for work. The Blackwell Trust portfolio spread across 3 monitors showed investments spanning 14 countries and 43 industries, with liquid assets totaling over $3 billion. Money that had been accumulating compound interest since her grandfather's death, money that Henry had no idea existed. She'd been protecting him by hiding her wealth, thinking it would keep their relationship pure and authentic. What a joke that had turned out to be. While she was safeguarding their marriage from the corrupting influence of her fortune, Henry was planning to dispose of her like outdated office equipment. Alan's fingers moved across her keyboard with mechanical precision, accessing databases and financial networks she hadn't touched in months. The Blackwell name opened doors that remained permanently closed to ordinary investors. Private equity firms, hedge funds, offshore accounts, shell corporations waiting to be activated like sleeping weapons in her arsenal. Time to wake them up. Her first call went to Marcus Webb at Sterling Financial Services, the investment firm that had been managing Blackwell assets for 2 decades. Marcus answered on the second ring despite the early hour, his voice instantly shifting from sleepy confusion to alert professionalism when he heard her name. "Good morning, Miss Blackwell. What can we do for you today?" Alan had been Mrs. Romano for 3 years, but Marcus still used her maiden name out of habit. Henry had never questioned why she kept separate bank accounts and maintained her professional identity. Just another detail about his wife that he'd never bothered to investigate thoroughly. "I need comprehensive intelligence on Romano construction and development," Alan said, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil churning beneath the surface. "Everything you can find about their corporate structure, major investors, silent partners, subsidiary companies, financial vulnerabilities. I want to know who owns what percentages and which shares might be available for acquisition." Marcus paused, clearly surprised by the request. That's an unusual target for Blackwell Investments. Mississippi Romano Construction operates primarily in the New York construction sector, which doesn't typically align with your portfolio strategy. "May I ask what's driving this interest?" "Personal reasons," Alan replied, a response that Marcus had learned over the years meant ask no further questions. "How quickly can you have the analysis completed?" "Given our resources and the complexity of construction industry networks, I'd estimate 48 hours for a complete financial profile. Should I prioritize this above your other pending investments?" "Yes. Drop everything else and focus exclusively on Romano Construction." "And Marcus?" "I want this kept completely confidential. No communication with the target company, no alerts that might indicate someone is researching their financial structure. This needs to be invisible until I'm ready to move." After ending the call, Alan poured herself coffee and settled in to wait. But waiting had never been her strength, especially not when her entire world had been turned upside down in a single evening. She opened her laptop and began her own preliminary research, using search engines and financial databases to piece together the public face of her husband's empire. Romano Construction and Development maintained an impressive online presence, featuring photographs of Manhattan skyscrapers and luxury developments that Henry's company had allegedly built or renovated. But as Alan dug deeper, patterns emerged that made her stomach twist with recognition. Many of the projects listed on Henry's website showed completion dates that coincided with major organized crime prosecutions in New York. Construction contracts awarded without competitive bidding. Subsidiary companies with names that didn't appear in standard business registries. Her husband wasn't just connected to the Italian crime family structure. His construction company was a massive money laundering operation, converting illegal proceeds into legitimate real estate investments across Manhattan and Brooklyn. Every beautiful building featured on his website represented dirty money transformed into clean assets through Henry's expertise in construction finance. And Victoria Chin wasn't just his secretary. According to LinkedIn profiles Alan found through careful searching, Victoria had an MBA from Wharton and previous experience in international banking. She was Henry's partner in building a criminal empire disguised as legitimate business success. The scope of Henry's deception staggered Alan as she uncovered layer after layer of complexity. Her husband had created an entirely false identity, presenting himself as a moderately successful contractor while actually controlling a multi-hundred-million-dollar criminal enterprise. And somehow, despite all her financial expertise and investigative skills, she believed his performance completely. But Henry's acting ability was about to become irrelevant, because Alan was done being the naive wife who accepted everything at face value. Marcus called back 18 hours ahead of schedule, his voice tight with excitement and confusion that made Alan grip her phone with anticipation. "Miss Blackwell, this is the most complex corporate structure I've analyzed in 15 years of investment banking. Romano Construction appears to be the visible tip of an iceberg that goes much deeper than standard business operations." Alan felt her pulse quicken. "What did you find?" "The company is privately held with 7 major investors controlling roughly 70% of shares. The remaining 30% is distributed among smaller investors who appear to be silent partners. But here's what's interesting. 3 of the major investors are shell corporations registered in Delaware and Nevada with ownership structures that are deliberately opaque. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to hide the true source of Romano Construction's funding." That sounded exactly like what Alan would expect from a money laundering operation. "Who are the smaller investors? The ones who might be willing to sell their shares?" Marcus rustled papers, clearly reading from detailed notes. "We identified 12 smaller investors holding between 1 and 5% each. Most appear to be legitimate business people who were offered investment opportunities through personal connections rather than public offerings. Based on our analysis, at least 8 of these investors could potentially be approached for share purchases without triggering public disclosure requirements." "Perfect." Alan felt a smile tug at her lips for the first time since walking into Henry's office. "How much would it cost to acquire controlling interest?" "That depends on your strategy," Marcus replied carefully. "If you moved slowly and purchased shares individually through separate entities, you could potentially acquire 40 to 50% ownership over several months without alerting the primary stakeholders." "But Miss Blackwell, I have to ask, are you planning to target your own husband's company?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Marcus couldn't possibly understand. Alan had built her entire marriage on protecting Henry from her wealth and power. Now she was preparing to use both against him in ways that would destroy everything he thought he controlled. "Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who underestimate us most completely," Alan said finally. "Prepare acquisition strategies for multiple scenarios. I want options for purchasing 15% immediately, 30% within 2 weeks, and 51% within a month. Use whatever shell corporations and offshore entities are necessary to keep my involvement invisible until I'm ready to reveal it. Miss Blackwell, this represents a massive financial commitment with significant legal and personal risks. Perhaps we should discuss." "Marcus," Alan interrupted, her voice carrying the authority that came from controlling billions of dollars. "I didn't build the Blackwell fortune by avoiding risks or backing down from complex situations. Romano Construction is about to become a Blackwell acquisition whether they realize it or not. The only question is how quickly I can make it happen." After ending the call, Alan sat back in her chair and considered the irony of her situation. Henry thought she was helpless, clueless, and easily disposable. Instead, she was a financial predator with resources that dwarfed his entire criminal empire. He'd spent 3 years deceiving her about his true business, never realizing that his wife had been concealing wealth that could buy and sell his operation 10 times over. But Alan's advantages went beyond money. She understood how power actually worked in the business world, how influence flowed through networks of connection and mutual benefit. Henry might command respect through intimidation and violence, but Alan controlled respect through competence and capital. His world operated on fear. Hers operated on results. And she was about to demonstrate exactly what kind of results $3 billion could purchase when properly motivated. The next morning, Alan began implementing her strategy with surgical precision. She established meeting appointments with 3 different investment firms, each tasked with researching separate aspects of Romano Construction's vulnerability. No single firm would see the complete picture, but together they would provide her with every detail she needed to dismantle Henry's empire piece by piece. Her first meeting was with Catherine Price at Metropolitan Securities, a woman Alan had worked with on several previous acquisitions. Catherine specialized in identifying investment opportunities that others overlooked, particularly in industries with complex ownership structures. "I need you to contact the smaller investors in Romano Construction," Alan explained during their lunch meeting at a discreet restaurant in Midtown. Feel them out about potential sale interest without revealing who's asking. Many of these people probably invested as favors to friends rather than serious business decisions. They might welcome an opportunity to liquidate their positions at attractive prices. Catherine nodded, making notes in her elegant handwriting. What price range are you considering? 20 to 30% above fair market value. Alan replied without hesitation. I want these transactions completed quickly and quietly. Premium prices ensure cooperation and discretion. By the end of the week, Alan had set in motion a coordinated assault on Henry's financial foundation that he wouldn't detect until it was far too late to prevent. Multiple firms were approaching Romano construction investors through intermediaries. Offshore corporations were being activated to hide her involvement, and legal documentation was being prepared for rapid share transfers once negotiations concluded. Henry continued his normal routine, coming home each evening with stories about difficult projects and challenging clients. He kissed Alan's cheek with casual affection, never suspecting that his loving wife was systematically acquiring ownership of everything he'd built. Victoria Chin's name never came up in conversation, but Alan noticed how often Henry checked his phone and how frequently he claimed evening meetings that kept him away from home. Let him enjoy his secret romance while he still could. Alan had more important things to focus on than her husband's affair. She was building something much more devastating than emotional confrontation. She was building his complete financial destruction. The first share purchase completed on a Tuesday morning while Henry was supposedly meeting with architects about a Brooklyn renovation project. Alan acquired 4.5% of Romano Construction through a shell corporation registered in Delaware, paying 40% above market value to ensure the investors' immediate cooperation and silence. 15% ownership was just the beginning. But as Alan signed the acquisition documents, she felt something shift inside her chest. The naive wife who'd believed in her marriage was gone forever. In her place sat a financial predator who'd just taken the first bite out of her prey. Henry Romano had no idea that his greatest threat was sleeping beside him every night, planning his downfall with the same careful attention he'd once found so attractive in his wife. The Romano family dinner table had never felt more like a stage, and Alan was delivering the performance of her lifetime. She smiled at Henry's mother across the table, complimented his sister's new haircut, and laughed at his brother Tony's jokes about construction workers and city permits, all while mentally calculating how many more shares she needed to acquire before calling the emergency shareholder meeting that would destroy Henry's world. 3 weeks had passed since Alan began her systematic acquisition of Romano Construction, and she now owned 38% of her husband's criminal empire. Henry sat beside her cutting his osso buco, completely oblivious to the financial predator masquerading as his devoted wife. Alan, honey, Henry's mother said warmly, you've been so quiet tonight. Everything okay with work? I know freelance consulting can be unpredictable. If only she knew that her daughter-in-law's freelance consulting involved dismantling her son's business empire 1 percentage point at a time. Alan managed a perfect smile, the kind she'd perfected during years of charity galas where appearing pleasant mattered more than feeling genuine emotions. Actually, things have been surprisingly busy, Alan replied, reaching for her wine glass with a steady hand. I've been working on some corporate acquisitions that require a lot of research and planning. Very detailed work, but potentially very rewarding. Henry glanced at her with mild interest, the same expression he might give to discussion of the weather forecast. That's great, babe. Just don't overwork yourself. You know how you get when you're stressed. The condescension in his voice would have stung 3 weeks ago. Now it simply confirmed that Henry's arrogance would be his downfall. He genuinely believed his wife was incapable of anything beyond small-scale freelance projects, never imagining that she controlled enough capital to purchase Manhattan real estate portfolios for entertainment. Alan's phone buzzed discreetly with a text from Marcus Webb confirming that another investor had accepted their offer. David Kellerman, who owned 3% of Romano Construction, had agreed to sell his shares for 45% above market value through a shell corporation based in Nevada. That brought Alan's total ownership to 41%, just 10 percentage points away from the controlling interest that would make her Henry's boss instead of his victim. Tony Romano launched into a story about problems with city inspectors on his latest project, gesturing with his fork as he described bureaucratic incompetence and corrupt officials who demanded bribes for basic permits. Alan nodded and made appropriate sounds of sympathy while thinking about how Tony's construction projects were probably fronts for money laundering just like his brother's company. The entire Romano family was complicit in Henry's criminal enterprise, she realized as she watched them discuss business with casual references to cash payments, off-the-books workers, and projects that existed primarily on paper. They'd welcomed her into their family, while keeping her completely ignorant of what they actually did for a living. 3 years of Sunday dinners, holiday celebrations, and intimate conversations where everyone except Alan knew the truth about Romano construction. But their deception was about to become irrelevant, because Alan Blackwell had learned something important during her weeks of corporate warfare. Revenge served cold was infinitely more satisfying than heated confrontation. After dinner, Henry drove them home through Manhattan traffic while Alan responded to emails from her acquisition team. Catherine Price had contacted 2 more investors who expressed interest in selling their Romano construction shares, particularly when offered premium prices for quick transactions. Alan's network of intermediaries was systematically approaching every vulnerable shareholder, offering deals too attractive to refuse. "You've been on your phone a lot lately," Henry commented as they waited at a red light. "Big project keeping you busy?" Alan looked up from typing acquisition instructions, meeting her husband's eyes with perfect composure. "Something like that. Just trying to close a deal that I've been working on for weeks. It's going to change everything once it's finalized." Henry smiled, the expression reaching his dark eyes in a way that would have melted her heart before she discovered his affair with Victoria Chun. "Well, just remember to celebrate when it's over. You deserve recognition for all your hard work." The irony was overwhelming. Henry encouraging his wife to celebrate the very deal that would destroy his criminal empire and expose his betrayals. Alan managed an appropriately grateful smile, already imagining his expression when she revealed herself as the majority shareholder of everything he'd built. Back in their penthouse, Henry disappeared into his home office to handle what he described as urgent business calls. Alan knew these evening sessions involved coordinating with Victoria Chun and planning their future together after disposing of his inconvenient wife. She could hear his voice through the closed door, speaking in the low, intimate tones he once reserved for conversations with her. Instead of feeling hurt, Alan felt energized. Every secret phone call, every lie about working late, every moment Henry spent planning her elimination was additional motivation for her corporate assault. She settled into her own office and opened encrypted communications with her acquisition team. The financial war was accelerating beyond her original timeline. Marcus Webb reported that Romano Construction's accountants had begun noticing unusual trading activity around their privately held shares. Someone in Henry's organization was asking questions about who might be purchasing stock from their smaller investors. Alan considered slowing down to avoid detection, then decided against caution. Speed was her advantage. Henry's criminal organization might excel at intimidation and violence, but they lacked experience with sophisticated financial warfare. By the time they understood what was happening, Alan would already control their entire company. Her next target was Patricia Voss, an interior designer who owned 5% of Romano Construction after investing in Henry's company during its early expansion phase. Patricia had known Alan socially for over a year, attending several of the same charity events and cultural fundraisers that filled Manhattan's social calendar. Alan called Patricia directly, bypassing intermediaries for the first time since beginning her acquisition campaign. "Patricia, this is Alan Romano. I hope you don't mind me reaching out personally, but I wanted to discuss a potential business opportunity that might interest you." Patricia's surprise was evident in her voice. "Alan, of course. What kind of opportunity?" "I represent some investors who are looking to diversify their portfolios with small construction company holdings. They're particularly interested in Romano Construction because of its strong performance and growth potential. I know you have shares in Henry's company, and my clients are prepared to offer substantially above current market value for immediate purchase." There was a pause as Patricia processed this unexpected call. "You're buying shares in your own husband's company?" Alan had prepared for this question, crafting an explanation that was technically true while concealing her real intentions. "Henry and I keep our business interests completely separate. This is purely financial, and the investors I represent are offering prices that make this an excellent liquidation opportunity for anyone looking to diversify their holdings. Patricia agreed to consider the offer, promising to review the documentation Alan's team would send within 24 hours. Another 5% within reach, bringing Alan tantalizingly close to the 46% threshold that would give her effective control over all major business decisions. But acquiring shares was only part of Alan's strategy. She was also preparing the legal foundation for what would happen after she revealed her majority ownership. Corporate attorneys were drafting documents that would immediately restructure Romano Construction's leadership, remove Henry from all decision-making authority, and establish Alan as the company's controlling shareholder with power to investigate every aspect of the business operations. Henry would wake up one morning to discover that his criminal empire belonged to the wife he'd planned to eliminate. The following evening brought another family obligation, this time a birthday celebration for Henry's cousin Marco at an upscale Italian restaurant in Little Italy. Alan wore a black cocktail dress and smiled through 2 hours of conversation about construction projects, family gossip, and shared memories that excluded her from most references. She noticed Victoria Chun watching her from across the restaurant. Henry's secretary sat at a corner table with friends, occasionally glancing toward the Romano family celebration with calculating eyes. Victoria's presence felt deliberate rather than coincidental, as if she was studying Alan for signs of suspicion or awareness. Alan met Victoria's gaze directly, offering a polite smile that revealed nothing about her true knowledge or intentions. Let Henry's mistress wonder what his wife might know. Uncertainty was just another weapon in Alan's arsenal. During the drive home, Henry seemed unusually quiet, checking his phone repeatedly and frowning at messages that apparently required immediate attention. "Everything okay?" Alan asked, her voice filled with wifely concern. "Just some complications with the Brooklyn project," Henry replied, but his jaw was tight with tension that suggested more serious problems. "Some investors are asking questions about project financing and ownership structures. Nothing I can't handle, but it's creating unnecessary stress." Alan felt satisfaction bloom in her chest. Henry's organization was finally beginning to realize that someone was targeting their business operations. But their investigation was focused on external threats, never suspecting that the greatest danger was sitting in the passenger seat planning their complete destruction. That night, while Henry slept beside her, Alan reviewed final acquisition documents for Patricia Voss's 5% share purchase. Her lawyers had structured the transaction through a Cayman Islands corporation that would be completely untraceable to Blackwell assets until Alan chose to reveal her involvement. By morning, she would own 46% of Romano Construction and Development. By the end of the week, she would control 51%, and Henry's entire criminal empire would belong to his supposedly naive wife. Alan signed the documents electronically and transmitted them to her legal team for immediate processing. In 12 hours, the transfer would be complete and irreversible. She turned to look at Henry's sleeping profile, his features relaxed and peaceful in the dim light from the city outside their bedroom windows. He looked like the man she'd fallen in love with 3 years ago, before she knew about his criminal activities or his affair with Victoria Chun, before she understood that their entire marriage had been built on mutual deception. Tomorrow, she would take another step toward destroying everything Henry thought he controlled. And she would do it with the same smile she'd worn throughout their marriage. The perfect wife executing the perfect revenge against the husband who'd underestimated her in every possible way. Henry Romano was about to learn that his greatest mistake wasn't keeping secrets from his wife. His greatest mistake was believing she was powerless to keep secrets from him. The final signature that would make Alan Blackwell the majority owner of Romano Construction and Development required exactly 4 seconds to complete. She signed Patricia Voss's share transfer documents at 11:43 on a Thursday morning while Henry was supposedly inspecting a construction site in Queens that Alan now knew existed only on paper. 51%. Controlling interest. Complete ownership of her husband's criminal empire. Alan sat back in her home office chair and allowed herself 30 seconds of pure satisfaction. 3 weeks ago, she'd been the naive wife who brought her cheating husband dinner to his office. Today, she controlled every aspect of his business operations, his financial assets, and his carefully constructed identity as a legitimate contractor. The transformation felt like emerging from a chrysalis, shedding the skin of victimhood to reveal the predator she'd always been capable of becoming. Henry had awakened something in her that $3 billion in inherited wealth never had, the desire to completely destroy someone who'd underestimated her. Marcus Webb called within minutes of the transaction's completion, his voice tight with professional excitement and personal concern. "Miss Blackwell, the Patricia Voss acquisition is finalized. You now own controlling interest in Romano Construction and Development. But I have to ask one final time. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with an emergency shareholder meeting? Once you file those papers, there's no way to maintain anonymity. Your husband will know exactly who's been systematically acquiring his company." "That's precisely the point," Alan replied, her voice steady with conviction she'd never felt about anything in her entire life. "File the paperwork immediately. I want the emergency shareholder meeting scheduled for next Tuesday at 10 a.m. in Romano Construction's main conference room. Send formal notification to all investors, board members, and company officers that the majority shareholder is exercising their right to call an immediate meeting regarding fundamental changes to corporate leadership." There was a pause as Marcus absorbed the implications. "This is going to create significant legal and personal complications. Miss Blackwell, your husband's organization won't respond well to losing control of their primary business operation." Alan smiled, an expression that would have terrified Henry if he'd been present to witness it. "Let me worry about Henry's response. Your job is to ensure every legal requirement is met perfectly. I want this takeover to be unassailable from every possible angle." After ending the call, Alan opened her laptop and began preparing for the most important presentation of her life. The emergency shareholder meeting would be her public debut as the majority owner of Romano Construction, the moment when she stopped hiding behind shell corporations and revealed herself as the financial predator who'd been stalking her prey for 3 weeks. But this confrontation required more than just legal documentation. Alan needed to present herself as someone who commanded respect, someone who belonged in the boardroom where she would destroy Henry's carefully constructed world. The naive wife who discovered her husband's affair had to disappear completely, replaced by the Blackwell heiress who'd been hiding behind freelance consulting fiction for 3 years. Alan walked to her closet and selected a charcoal gray suit that she'd purchased for serious business meetings, but never worn. The cut was severe and expensive, tailored to project authority rather than femininity. She paired it with her grandmother's pearls, the ones that had belonged to 5 generations of Blackwell women who'd built and protected the family fortune through decades of financial warfare. Looking at herself in the mirror, Alan saw someone Henry had never met. This woman wouldn't cower in doorways watching her husband embrace his mistress. This woman wouldn't accept lies about working late or explanations about difficult clients. This woman owned everything Henry thought he controlled, and she was done pretending otherwise. The call came at 2:15 in the afternoon while Alan was reviewing Romano Construction's corporate bylaws to ensure her shareholder meeting procedures were flawless. Henry's name appeared on her phone screen, and she answered with perfectly calibrated surprise. "Alan, honey, something strange is happening at work," Henry said, his voice carrying tension she hadn't heard since their early dating days when he was establishing his business. "Someone's been buying shares in my company, and they've called an emergency shareholder meeting for next Tuesday. My lawyers are trying to figure out who's behind it, but the paperwork shows purchases through multiple shell corporations that are impossible to trace." Alan made appropriate sounds of concern while mentally reviewing her legal team's work. "How much of the company do they own?" "That's what's so crazy," Henry continued, his frustration evident despite his attempts to sound calm. "Whoever this is, they own 51%. Controlling interest. They can restructure the entire company, remove officers, change operations, everything. And I have no idea who they are or what they want." The irony was delicious. Henry explaining to his wife that some mysterious entity had acquired the power to destroy everything he'd built, never suspecting that mysterious entity was sitting in their penthouse planning his downfall with scientific precision. "I'm so sorry, honey," Alan said, injecting her voice with the sympathy she'd once felt genuinely for his business problems. "Is there anything you can do to stop them?" "My lawyers are exploring options, But since the share purchases were legitimate and followed proper procedures, there's not much legal recourse. The meeting is scheduled for Tuesday morning in our main conference room. I'll have to face whoever this is and find out what they're planning to do with my company. Alan felt a thrill of anticipation that she carefully kept out of her voice. Will I ever get to meet this mysterious shareholder? I doubt it, Henry replied grimly. This feels like corporate raiding, probably some investment firm looking to strip assets and resell components for profit. They're not interested in personal relationships or family considerations. This is purely business. How wrong he was. This was the most personal business transaction in the history of corporate warfare. That evening, Victoria Chun appeared at their penthouse unannounced, something that had never happened during the 3 years Alan had been married to Henry. She claimed to need Henry's signature on urgent contracts, but Alan noticed how Victoria's eyes tracked the layout of their home, cataloging details with the attention of someone planning future occupancy. Henry, Victoria said as she prepared to leave, I've been thinking about the shareholder meeting situation. Have you considered that this might be connected to someone who knows about our personal business activities? Someone who might have access to information about company operations that isn't available through public records? Henry frowned, clearly not following Victoria's line of reasoning. What do you mean? I mean someone with inside knowledge about Romano Construction's real business model, Victoria explained, her gaze flickering briefly toward Alan before returning to Henry's face. Someone who understands that acquiring control of your company means acquiring control of much more than construction projects. Alan felt her pulse quicken as she realized Victoria was suggesting exactly what was actually happening. Henry's mistress had identified the possibility that the corporate takeover was an inside job, potentially orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of Henry's criminal operations. But Henry dismissed Victoria's concerns with the same arrogance that had led him to underestimate his wife for 3 years. Victoria, honey, you're overthinking this, Henry said, his tone condescending in the way that made Alan want to reveal her identity immediately just to watch his expression. Whoever bought those shares did it through sophisticated financial instruments that require serious capital and professional expertise. This is corporate raiding by some investment firm, not personal revenge by someone we know. Victoria looked like she wanted to argue further, but Henry's dismissive attitude ended the conversation. After she left, Alan marveled at how perfectly Henry's arrogance served her purposes. His refusal to consider threats from people he deemed beneath his attention was the exact vulnerability that had allowed her acquisition campaign to succeed. Over the weekend, Alan finalized every detail of her Tuesday morning presentation. Legal documents establishing her identity as the majority shareholder. Financial records proving the legitimacy of her share purchases. Corporate restructuring plans that would immediately remove Henry from all decision-making authority and place Romano Construction under complete Blackwell control. She also prepared for Henry's reaction, reviewing security protocols with her personal protection team, and ensuring that her lawyers would be present to document any threats or intimidation attempts that might occur when Henry realized his wife had destroyed his criminal empire. Monday night, Alan lay awake beside her sleeping husband, listening to his steady breathing and thinking about how completely their lives were about to change. Tomorrow, the woman Henry married would cease to exist. In her place would stand the Blackwell heiress who'd been hiding behind marriage and modest freelance fiction for 3 years. Henry had no idea that his greatest enemy had been sleeping beside him every night, planning his downfall with the same methodical attention he'd once found attractive in his wife's personality. Tomorrow, he would discover that underestimating Alan Blackwell had been the most expensive mistake of his criminal career. Alan's phone buzzed with a final confirmation from Marcus Webb. All legal documentation was complete. Security arrangements were finalized. The conference room at Romano Construction was reserved for 10 a.m. Everything was ready for the most devastating corporate takeover in New York business history. Alan smiled in the darkness, already imagining Henry's face when she walked into that conference room as the majority shareholder of everything he thought he controlled. Tomorrow, the hunter would finally reveal herself to her prey, and Henry Romano would learn that his supposedly powerless wife had been the most dangerous person in his life all along. The Romano Construction conference room had never felt more like a battlefield and Alan Blackwell was about to claim victory in a war her enemies never knew they were fighting. She sat in her car outside the building at 9:55 a.m., watching through tinted windows as Henry's allies filed into the meeting that would destroy their criminal empire. Marcus Webb sat beside her, reviewing final legal documents with the precision of a man who understood that every detail mattered when corporate dynasties were being overthrown. "Are you ready for this, Miss Blackwell?" Marcus asked quietly. "Once you walk through those doors, there's no going back to the life you had before." Alan adjusted her grandmother's pearls and smoothed the charcoal gray suit that transformed her from Henry's wife into the Blackwell heiress she'd always been. The woman who married Henry Romano 3 years ago was about to disappear forever, replaced by someone who'd been hiding behind freelance consulting fiction while secretly controlling enough wealth to buy Manhattan real estate for entertainment. "I've been ready for 3 weeks," Alan replied, her voice steady with conviction that surprised even her. "Henry thinks he's about to face some anonymous corporate raider. Instead, he's going to discover that his greatest enemy has been sleeping beside him every night, planning his destruction with the same attention to detail he once found so attractive." They entered the building together, Marcus carrying the briefcase full of legal documentation that would immediately transfer control of Romano Construction from Henry to his supposedly powerless wife. The security guard who'd recognized Alan as Mrs. Romano for 3 years looked confused by her transformation into someone who commanded boardroom respect rather than wifely deference. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt like ascending toward destiny. Alan had ridden this same elevator dozens of times, usually bringing Henry dinner or meeting him for lunch dates when she was still naive enough to believe their marriage was built on mutual honesty. Today, she was arriving as the majority shareholder who would strip him of everything he'd built through criminal deception. The conference room's glass walls provided a perfect view of Henry's preparation for battle against an unknown enemy. He stood at the head of the polished table, his expensive suit impeccable as always, speaking in low, urgent tones to the team of lawyers and associates he'd assembled to fight whatever threat was about to materialize. Victoria Chun sat at Henry's right hand, her position clearly indicating her importance in Romano Construction's hierarchy beyond her official title as executive assistant. She was dressed in a red power suit that suggested she expected to play a significant role in today's confrontation, probably planning to support Henry against whatever corporate raider had targeted their operation. Tony Romano occupied the chair to Henry's left, his expression grim as he reviewed documents that Alan knew detailed the systematic share purchases that had stripped their family business away from them piece by piece. The other attendees included board members, major investors, and legal representatives who'd been summoned to witness what they expected would be a hostile takeover attempt. None of them were prepared for the truth about to walk through their door. Alan paused outside the conference room, allowing herself one final moment as Henry's wife before becoming his destroyer. Through the glass, she could see her husband's profile as he gestured emphatically to his team, probably explaining his strategy for maintaining control despite losing majority ownership. His confidence was absolute, his authority unquestionable among the people who'd followed his leadership for years. That confidence was about to be shattered beyond repair. Alan opened the conference room door at exactly 10 a.m., her entrance immediate silencing every conversation as 15 pairs of eyes turned toward the woman they'd never expected to see. Marcus Webb followed her into the room, his presence adding legal weight to what was about to unfold. Henry's expression shifted from confident expectation to complete bewilderment as his wife walked toward the head of the conference table with purposeful strides that belonged in boardrooms rather than their domestic life. Alan had never moved like this in his presence before, never carried herself with the authority of someone who controlled billions of dollars rather than freelance consulting projects. "Alan." Henry's voice cracked slightly as he processed her unexpected appearance. "What are you doing here?" "This is a private business meeting about corporate acquisitions." Alan reached the head of the table and placed her hands on the polished surface, looking directly into her husband's confused eyes before speaking the words that would destroy his world. "I'm here because I am the corporate acquisition, Henry. I own 51% of Romano Construction and Development. I am the mysterious shareholder who's been systematically purchasing your company for the past 3 weeks. And as of this moment, I control everything you thought belonged to you." The silence in the conference room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Victoria Chin's pen dropping onto her legal pad as she stared at Alan with undisguised shock. Tony Romano's face had gone pale as he absorbed the implications of his brother's wife claiming majority ownership of their family business. Henry's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, his mind clearly struggling to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd married. The confident crime boss who commanded respect through intimidation and violence had been rendered speechless by his supposedly powerless wife. "You're insane," Henry finally managed, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "You couldn't afford to buy 5% of my company, let alone 51%. You're a freelance consultant who barely makes enough money to cover your personal expenses." Alan smiled, the expression cold enough to make several board members shift uncomfortably in their chairs. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a document that Marcus had prepared specifically for this moment, sliding it across the table toward her husband. "That would be true if I were actually a struggling freelance consultant," Alan replied, her voice carrying the authority that came from controlling generational wealth. "But I'm not. I'm Alan Blackwell, heir to the Blackwell Investment Trust, which currently manages assets totaling $3.7 billion. I've been hiding my real identity since the day we met because I thought our marriage would be purer if you loved me for myself rather than my fortune." She gestured toward the document, now sitting in front of Henry's trembling hands. "Those papers detail every share purchase made over the past 3 weeks, along with proof of my identity as the Blackwell heiress and legal confirmation that I now own controlling interest in Romano Construction and Development. Everything you think you control actually belongs to me." Henry's eyes moved across the documentation, his face growing paler as he absorbed irrefutable proof that his wife had systematically acquired his criminal empire while he planned her elimination. The confidence that had defined him throughout their marriage crumbled as he realized the scope of his miscalculation. But Victoria Chun recovered from her shock faster than the others, leaning forward with the aggressive intelligence that had made her valuable to Henry's organization. "This is impossible," Victoria declared, her voice sharp with challenge. "Even if you are who you claim to be, you couldn't have researched our company's ownership structure without inside information about Romano Construction's real business operations. You would have needed to know that Henry's construction projects are fronts for money laundering, that our investor network includes organized crime figures, that this entire company exists to convert illegal proceeds into legitimate assets." Alan turned her attention to Victoria with predatory focus, finally addressing the woman who'd been planning to replace her in Henry's life and business. "You're absolutely right, Victoria. I couldn't have accomplished this acquisition without intimate knowledge of Romano Construction's actual business model. Which brings us to the other reason I called this meeting." Alan reached into her briefcase again, withdrawing photographs that made Victoria's face go white with recognition. The images showed Henry and Victoria in passionate embrace in his office, captured through the partially open door that had revealed their affair 3 weeks earlier. "I discovered Henry's relationship with you on the same evening I learned about his criminal activities and his plans to eliminate me from his life," Alan continued, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her revelation. "So while my husband was planning my permanent removal and Victoria was helping him envision a future together, I was systematically acquiring ownership of everything they thought they controlled." Henry's hands shook as he stared at the photographs documenting his betrayal, finally understanding that his wife's corporate takeover wasn't coincidental timing or business opportunism. This was personal revenge executed with the precision of someone who possessed both massive wealth and sophisticated understanding of corporate warfare. "Alan, I can explain," Henry began, but she cut him off with a gesture that commanded immediate silence. "There's nothing to explain that I don't already understand," Alan replied. "You've been living a double life for our entire marriage, hiding your criminal activities while planning my eventual disposal so you could build a future with Victoria. What you never suspected is that I was also living a double life, hiding wealth that makes your entire operation look like petty crime in comparison." She turned to address the room, speaking to the board members and investors who'd been summoned to witness what they thought would be a hostile takeover attempt. "Effective immediately, I am removing Henry Romano from all positions of authority within Romano Construction and Development. Victoria Chun is terminated from her position and banned from company premises. Tony Romano will remain as operational manager under my direct supervision, provided he can demonstrate that his involvement with money laundering was limited to following his brother's instructions rather than initiating criminal activities. The transformation was complete. The naive wife who'd brought her husband dinner had evolved into the financial predator who'd stripped him of everything he'd built through criminal deception. Alan stood at the head of the conference table, commanding respect from hardened criminals who'd never imagined that Henry's powerless wife could become their destroyer. But as Alan watched Henry process the complete destruction of his world, she felt something unexpected stirring beneath her satisfaction. The man staring at her with dawning comprehension wasn't just the criminal who'd betrayed her trust. He was also the person she'd fallen in love with 3 years ago, before either of them had revealed their true natures to each other. For the first time since beginning her corporate assault, Alan wondered if revenge was going to be as satisfying as she'd anticipated. Because looking at Henry's devastated expression, she realized that her victory had come at the cost of destroying the only person who'd ever loved her for who she appeared to be rather than what she actually possessed. And despite everything he'd done, that loss hurt more than she'd expected. The conference room had emptied except for Alan and Henry, two people who'd been married for 3 years but were meeting each other for the first time as their authentic selves. Victoria Chun had been escorted from the building by security, her dreams of replacing Alan as Henry's partner destroyed along with her career. The board members and investors had filed out in stunned silence, processing the reality that Romano Construction now belonged to the Blackwell heiress rather than the crime boss they'd followed for years. Henry sat slumped in his chair, staring at the photographs of his affair with Victoria that lay scattered across the polished conference table like evidence in a criminal trial. The confident leader who'd commanded respect through intimidation and violence had been reduced to a man confronting the complete destruction of everything he'd built through deception. Alan remained standing at the head of the table, but her posture had softened from corporate predator to something more complex. The satisfaction she'd expected to feel at Henry's downfall was contaminated by unexpected pain at seeing someone she genuinely loved reduced to defeated confusion. "I need to understand why," Alan said finally, her voice quieter than the authoritative tone she'd used to destroy his world. "Not the business reasons or the strategic justifications. I need to understand why you were planning to eliminate me when I thought we were building a life together." Henry looked up from the photographs, his dark eyes filled with something Alan had never seen before: complete honesty without calculation or performance. "Because I was terrified you'd discover who I really was," Henry replied, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Not just the criminal activities, but the violence, the moral compromises, the things I'd done to build this empire that would horrify any decent person. I convinced myself that planning your elimination was protecting you from having to live with the knowledge of what your husband actually was." Alan felt tears threatening despite her determination to maintain composure. "But you were planning a future with Victoria. She knew about your criminal activities and didn't seem horrified." Henry's laugh was bitter, self-deprecating in a way that revealed depths of self-awareness Alan had never suspected. "Victoria was attracted to my power and wealth, not repulsed by the violence required to maintain them. She saw my criminal connections as advantages to be leveraged, not moral failures to be overcome. With Victoria, I never had to pretend to be better than I actually was." The admission hung between them, highlighting the fundamental difference between Alan's love and Victoria's opportunism. Alan had fallen in love with Henry's potential for goodness, while Victoria had embraced his capacity for darkness. "But that doesn't excuse the betrayal," Alan said, her voice steady despite the emotional complexity of the conversation. "You could have trusted me with the truth instead of planning my death while sharing your bed with someone else." Henry stood slowly, his movements careful as he approached the woman who now controlled his entire world. "You're right. I should have trusted you. But Alan, you were planning to hide $3 billion from me for the rest of our marriage. We were both living lies, just different kinds." The accuracy of his observation struck Alan like a physical blow. She'd spent 3 weeks focused on Henry's deception while ignoring her own massive secret, that had shaped every aspect of their relationship. The Blackwell heiress criticizing her husband for hiding his true identity was hypocrisy of the highest order. "I hid my wealth because I wanted you to love me for who I was rather than what I possessed," Alan replied. But even as she spoke the words, she recognized their inadequacy as justification for 3 years of deception. "And I hid my criminal activities because I wanted to protect you from the violence and moral corruption that money laundering requires," Henry countered. "We were both trying to preserve something pure in our relationship by keeping the complicated parts of ourselves separate." For the first time since discovering Henry's affair, Alan considered the possibility that their mutual deception might have emerged from similar motivations rather than fundamentally different moral frameworks. Both had been protecting the other from truths they believed would destroy the love they'd found together. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of recognition that their marriage had been built on parallel lies that both had justified as protection rather than betrayal. "So what happens now?" Henry asked, his voice carrying resignation rather than hope. "You own my company, you've destroyed my relationship with Victoria, and you've exposed my criminal activities to people who could use that information against me. Do you want me to disappear from your life completely?" Alan looked at her husband, really seeing him for the first time since their relationship began. Not the confident crime boss or the cheating spouse, but a complex man who'd made terrible choices while trying to protect someone he genuinely loved from consequences he believed she couldn't handle. "What I want," Alan said slowly, "is to build something honest together. No more separate lives, no more hidden identities, no more protecting each other from truths we think the other can't handle. I want a partnership where we use my financial resources and your operational expertise to create something legitimate and powerful." Henry's eyebrows rose with surprise. "You want to work together? After everything I've done? I want to work with the person you actually are, not the performance you've been giving me for 3 years, Alan replied. "Your criminal activities were morally wrong, but your business skills are extraordinary. You built a multi-hundred-million-dollar operation from nothing. That kind of capability shouldn't be wasted on money laundering when it could be applied to legitimate enterprises." Henry moved closer, his expression shifting from resignation to cautious hope. "What are you proposing?" Alan walked to the conference room's floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at Manhattan's skyline, while organizing thoughts that would determine their future. Romano Construction becomes a legitimate operation focused on luxury residential and commercial development, Alan explained. "We use Blackwell investment capital to acquire prime real estate and finance projects that don't require criminal connections. You handle operations, management, and construction oversight. I handle financing, strategic planning, and investor relations." Henry joined her at the windows, standing close enough that she could feel his familiar warmth without the deception that had contaminated their previous intimacy. "And personally?" Henry asked quietly. "Do we try to rebuild our marriage, or do we limit this to business partnership?" Alan turned to face him directly, studying the features she'd memorized during 3 years of believing she knew who he was. The man standing before her was both stranger and familiar, criminal and capable, deceptive and genuinely remorseful. "I want to try rebuilding our marriage on complete honesty," Alan said. "No more secrets, no more separate bank accounts, no more protecting each other from difficult truths. If we're going to make this work, it has to be as equals who understand exactly who they're choosing to love." Henry's smile was tentative but genuine, the first honest expression she'd seen from him since discovering his affair. "And if I mess up again? If the temptation to handle problems through violence or deception becomes too strong, then I use my $3 billion to destroy you more thoroughly than I did today," Alan replied with matching honesty. "This is a one-time offer, Henry. I'm willing to rebuild our relationship because I think the man I fell in love with is still in there somewhere. But if you betray that trust again, I won't hesitate to eliminate you from my life permanently." Henry nodded, understanding that Alan's offer came with consequences that would make his current downfall look gentle by comparison. "I accept your terms," Henry said formally. "Partnership in business and marriage, complete honesty about everything, and your permanent authority over our financial future if I prove unworthy of the trust you're offering." Alan extended her hand for a handshake that would seal their new agreement, both personal and professional. As Henry took her hand, she felt the same electric connection that had drawn them together 3 years earlier, but now it was grounded in truth rather than performance. The next 6 months transformed both Romano Construction and the Romano marriage into entities neither had expected when they first met at that charity gala. Alan's Blackwell capital enabled Henry's legitimate business vision on a scale he'd never imagined possible, while Henry's operational expertise turned Alan's abstract wealth into concrete achievements that benefited their community rather than exploiting it. Their penthouse became a true shared space where financial statements lay beside construction blueprints, where Alan's investment strategies complemented Henry's project management, where conversations flowed between personal intimacy and professional collaboration without artificial barriers. Henry discovered that loving someone who possessed more wealth and power than he did was actually liberating rather than emasculating. Alan's resources freed him to focus on building rather than struggling, creating rather than destroying, protecting rather than threatening. His criminal skills translated surprisingly well to legitimate business when applied with moral constraints and adequate capital. Alan learned that being honest about her wealth enhanced rather than corrupted their relationship. Henry's appreciation for her financial contributions was genuine rather than opportunistic, based on respect for her competence rather than desire for her assets. His love for the Blackwell heiress felt more authentic than his love for the freelance consultant who'd never actually existed. Their first major project together was a mixed-use development in Brooklyn that provided affordable housing alongside commercial spaces for local businesses. Henry's construction expertise ensured quality building, while Alan's financing kept costs manageable for working-class families. The project's success attracted attention from city planners and community organizations who wanted to replicate their model throughout New York. As they stood together on the roof of their completed development 6 months after the boardroom confrontation that had changed everything, Alan reflected on how completely their lives had been transformed by choosing honesty over deception. Have you ever wondered what your marriage would be like if you and your spouse stopped hiding who you really are from each other? Any regrets? Henry asked, his arm around Alan's waist as they watched the sunset paint their construction project in golden light. About destroying your criminal empire and forcing you to become a legitimate businessman who builds communities instead of exploiting them? Alan replied with a smile. Not even slightly. Henry laughed, the sound carrying genuine happiness that had been absent during their years of mutual deception. I meant regrets about choosing to rebuild rather than walking away. You could have taken your revenge and moved on to someone less complicated. Alan leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength of a man who'd chosen to become worthy of the second chance she'd offered. Complicated turned out to be more interesting than I expected, Alan said. And besides, destroying you was satisfying, but building something together is infinitely more rewarding. As they drove home through Manhattan traffic, Alan's phone buzzed with messages from Marcus Webb confirming their next acquisition opportunity and from city officials requesting meetings about expanding their affordable housing initiatives. Henry's phone showed similar activity from contractors and community leaders who wanted Romano Construction's involvement in upcoming projects. Their marriage had survived the complete destruction of its original foundation and been rebuilt on something stronger and more authentic. The woman who'd caught her husband kissing his secretary had chosen transformation over termination, partnership over revenge, future over past. And Henry Romano had learned that being loved for who he actually was felt infinitely better than being loved for who he pretended to be. The Blackwell fortune that had once been Alan's secret weapon had become their shared tool for building the kind of life and legacy that neither could have achieved alone. $3 billion in the hands of a woman committed to justice, guided by a man determined to create rather than destroy, turned out to be exactly the combination Manhattan needed for genuine positive change. Their story had begun with betrayal and deception, but it was ending with the kind of partnership that could reshape both their industry and their community for generations to come.